For startups and small businesses, sales growth is vital. It's the key to success. And now's a very difficult time for small businesses to be building and selling. We created GenieShares to help. We created GenieShares to build that sales pipeline, but also to create a broader awareness of the value of business in society and in communities. So we've been incredibly pleased that Salesforce, the world's leading customer relationship business, has teamed up with us and is providing us with support. Salesforce, of course, has inspired the world with its 1-1-1 model. And so I'm delighted today to be joined by Adam Spearing, the CTO EMEA of Salesforce, to tell us more. Adam, it's great to see you. Can you tell us a little bit about Salesforce and, critically, your support for entrepreneurs in community?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And thank you, Ben. We really appreciate this opportunity to connect with some of your wonderful customers out there. So let me tell you a little bit more about us and our values and who we are as Salesforce. So we're an organization that's built on 4 founding principles around trust, customer success, innovation, and equality. And it's really important to us that we live those values every single day. As an organization, trust is very critical to everything that we do and all the engagements we have, and we believe that that's the enduring quality that every business should have in its relationships with its employees and its customers. We also clearly value innovation as a technology company and an innovator ourselves, and we encourage others to innovate and try and free their minds to innovate as much as they possibly can. And equality. Equality, I think, is something that is a core tenet of what we do and we believe in. And within that kind of principle of equality, we also believe that that philanthropy should be a key part of every business. We built Salesforce not just on a new business and technology model, but also on a new philanthropic model as well. When we set the company up, originally, we started, Mark and the founders started with the principle of what we call our 1-1-1 model, where we give 1% of our profit, 1% of our equity, and 1% of our time to not-for-profits. And that's formed now into something called pledge1%.org, which is a global movement to encourage other entrepreneurs to do the same. So it's very much at the heart of what we do, which is why I'm delighted to spend some time with you this morning.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. And that 1% principle, of course, has helped shape GenieShares as well. And our first pilot project with a company called Employable, in which their founder, Peter Kelly, gave away 1% of the equity of his business, led fairly quickly, within 4 months, in fact, to more than tripling the value of his business with investors. So that was really primarily, of course, about the sales growth that resulted. What he did was he created a real sense of ownership in the community, not just among his customers and his employees, but really extending the engagement of his company. So the Salesforce model has really helped to inspire that. I wonder, especially in the UK, what you're doing at this critical time when so many businesses are really struggling to achieve cut through and to redefine the nature of their relationship with their broader stakeholder set. How you're supporting companies in the UK?
Yeah, and I think it's, as you say, these are challenging times and we've all got to do everything we can. So we've been working with the Small Business Network Enterprise Nation. We've been offering specific Salesforce capability and business grants of £5,000 to provide capital to small businesses to help keep them afloat, because cash flow is king at the moment, that's for sure. And hopefully these grants will help businesses to reopen and get back to this new normal as well. The grants program that we've been running is also part of a wider commitment to support small businesses specifically throughout the world. We've earmarked over $5 million of funds, with over $1 million of that specifically for UK businesses to help them through this period. We've also, to try and help some of these organizations, making investments at this time is challenging as well. So we've been offering a lot of our technology free through our care packages to help companies adjust and to help them get back on their feet as well. And longer term, as you are in one of those organizations, we want to help you with thought leadership, with tips, with ideas, with skills and experience for others who've done it before. So we've been providing a lot of that resource free to SMBs. So if you're sitting out there pondering on a question, then reach out to Salesforce. We've got a lot of resource that will help you as well. And there's a lot of learnings that are free to air. So if people are looking to how do they learn more skills and knowledge around how to grow their businesses, our trailhead environment is something that people can go to go and skill up. So, yeah, we've been trying to roll our sleeves up and do as much as we can to help the UK businesses at this challenging time.
Thank you. That's a fantastically broad package of measures for companies of every kind in every sector. And I'm particularly grateful for the support that Salesforce is giving to GenieShares and the companies involved with GenieShares, who between them have pledged now several £1 million worth of equity to be distributed to much increase the sense that the whole community has of ownership in growth, of ownership of enterprise and of innovation and technology. At a time when fewer people directly own shares than any time in recent history, clearly there's a danger of business and community detaching from each other. And so it's a great honour for us to work with so many companies that are really demonstrating that intimate connection, the way in which every entrepreneur comes out of the community and every entrepreneur should be seeking ways to give back. I'm just curious, we're inspired by what Salesforce does to extend the reach outside customers and employees and investors to bring benefits to the wider community. Why are you supporting GenieShares and the companies who are doing their bit, often much smaller companies than Salesforce, to extend that reach?
When we had our first conversation, Ben, it was really apparent to me that this is something very important. Our philosophy as an organization is we believe the business of business is to improve the state of the world, right? And that business should be a platform from change. And small business in particular is a cornerstone of innovation and economic growth. So, when I heard what you were doing and I looked at the synergies with our Pledge 111 and our 111 model, it was very apparent to me that this is something we actually really should support and get behind as well. And it's not just because we have lots of small business customers as well. It's the whole principle. This is the right thing to do. And so I'm very, very pleased, and it's very important to us that we get behind organisations such as GenieShare to really get that message out. And so it's an important step forward.
Brilliant. Well, thank you. We're delighted to be working with Salesforce. And as we look forward, I guess, with the combined impact of a pandemic and also the associated economic challenges, which mean that most sales cycles are slowing down and small businesses in particular are really feeling that. I wonder, as you look more broadly, with a global perspective of Salesforce perhaps, what changes you would like to see, and indeed what calls to action you have, not just for entrepreneurs, but more broadly for corporates and even perhaps for policymakers.
Yeah, and I think we are very privileged as an organisation to have the opportunity to speak to lots of CEOs, and we are, for many of them, their trusted digital advisor, helping them on every step of their journey. And what we really want to see, and I think this crisis has demonstrated that more than ever before, that purpose and value should be centre of everything that we do. I heard a CEO say to me recently that they've realised that purpose is more important than profit now. And that, I think, is a huge step forward. And I would love to see more businesses embrace that as a principle in how they're working. We also released recently a report on Salesforce stakeholders' perception reports back in March earlier this year that showed there is an absolute craving for a better form of capitalism, a capitalism that works for everybody in society. And I think this what you're doing is an example of how that should operate. So I would love and I would encourage every CEO of every organization, whether you are an individual with a small business of 2 or 3 people or running a large organization out there, to embrace this, to think about what it is that you want to give back to society, because ultimately, we've all learned that we're all in this together, and the more that we can support and help each other, the better an environment we create for everybody, and the more fun it is, right? And that's what I think is really important, that we are committed to a new form of capitalism.
Well, Adam, thank you very much indeed. It's very clear from our experience with GenieShares already that those leaders who demonstrate a broad approach to ownership, who are prepared to engage more broadly with their community, see stronger sales growth. And I guess I'd kind of suggest the final word really goes to Jodie, who received £30,000 worth of equity from Peter. She said what matters was the sense of ownership. It's not necessarily the monetary value. It's the sense of having a stake in growth. And of course, Peter's seen his business thrive as a result. And now, with millions of pounds of equity pledged by some of the UK's leading entrepreneurs. We're seeing real examples of that kind of inclusive, responsible leadership. It's a great pleasure to have the support of Salesforce, and thank you very much indeed for all you're doing for GenieShares.
It's an honour to be part of it, Ben.